On Friday last, Father Gregory Boyle, the founder of Homeboy Industries, was speaking to a room filled with Christian leaders. And in it, he gave us, in a nutshell, the approach to Christian ministry that is effective. Listen, listen. Love, love. According to Boyle, that is the key to doing ministry. Listen, listen. Love, love. One of the beautiful benefits of poetry is that it slows our speaking down enough so that we learn to listen. It speeds up our listening. Listen, listen. Love, love. Today we have deliverance poetry coming to us from the prophet Zechariah. In his teaching on prophetic imagination, Walter Brueggemann, to whom I'm indebted for a number of these thoughts today, tells us that the imagination that comes with the prophet's poetry is always a contested imagination. That is, there is also an imagination, and he says, make no mistake about it, even the world's reality is an imagination. It's a way of thinking about things. There's always a contest between the world's way of seeing things and saying this is real and the prophetic imagination. Luke recognizes this, and repeatedly in the opening chapters, he connects his story to the brutal imagination of the empire. Immediately after his first 4 verses in which he dedicates the gospel to Theophilus, he says, in the days of King Herod, Luke 1:5. We know the Christmas story that opens with, and it came to pass in those days when Caesar was Augustus and Quirinius was governor of Syria, and so on the story goes. Luke chapter 3, which tells John the Baptist's story, also opens similarly. In the 15th year of the Caesar Tiberius, when Pilate was the governor in Judea, Herod was the king in Galilee, etc. Rome is Pharaoh's Egypt, Isaiah's Babylon, the contemporary, what Brueggemann calls individualistic, therapeutic, technological, consumeristic militarism, the reality of our world. We still see that imagination reflected in our daily news. We live in a world where the greatest reality of the Constitution is the Second Amendment, which gives freedom to a 15-year-old boy to use the pistol his father purchased a couple of days earlier to gun down 4 Michigan high school students. Hollywood, Madison Avenue, and Hallmark remind us that unless you're sitting close to a warm fire with a couple of pets and a couple of kids and a mom and a dad, well, you really haven't captured the imagination of our world. Loneliness, aloneness. Traditionalism runs an unbroken line from excluding women from pastoral leadership to discounting racial inclusion as critical race theory, to rejecting queer people as unquestionable holiness in our world. Now, with the story itself in Scripture, there is a recurring pattern. Notice that the voiceless, distorted expressions are a silent cry for help. In the great salvation story of the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 2, the people are groaning in their slavery. Text says nothing about prayer. It simply says that their groans reached the ears of God. Listen, listen, love, love. And God remembered the covenant that God had with the ancestors and began to move. In our story here in Luke chapter 1, Zechariah has been living in silence for the time that his son was growing in the womb, unable to express any kind of word of hope. Notice that in both of these cases, that silent, inarticulate expression of desperation is a word that is transformed then into a clear expression, an appeal for God's care. Notice also the key roles that mothers and women play in both of these stories. In Exodus, the mothers Shiphrah and Puah are instrumental in inserting God's saving word into the world. In Luke chapter 1, it's Elizabeth and Mary who are essential players in bringing possibility for salvation. In fact, in our larger text today, in Luke chapter 1, the text says that the neighbors recognized that God's mercy was magnified in the life of Elizabeth. That word mercy is used 6 times in Luke's gospel. Once later on, when the lawyer responds to Jesus' Good Samaritan story by saying, well, the neighbor is the one who expresses mercy, shows mercy. The other 5 times right here in the opening chapter of Luke, twice in Mary's song and then twice again in Zechariah's song. But at the middle of that section, it is Elizabeth who begins to experience this mercy of God. The mercy that the Old Testament prophet Zechariah recognizes and alludes to is a word that's connected to covenant loyalty over and over again in the Old Testament. It's loving kindness. It is tender compassion. It is the nucleus, the nugget of Christian theology, again, according to Father Boyle. This idea of tender compassion. And it is a poetic response of Zechariah that offers this poetic imagination that captures what is not yet seen and makes it real for his world. Consumeristic militarism lives in a closed world in which only human actions count, a world in which humans exercise control, but a world permeated with the anxiety that comes with pursuing wealth, power, violence, autonomy. Zechariah's poetic imagination is anchored in blessing. Blessed be the God who delivers. It is anchored in the tradition-based poetry of the Old Testament. Almost every phrase that comes in this hymn is a hymn that echoes an Old Testament truth. And it produces a vision. You'll notice the tense of the words for both what is and what will be. In Zechariah's poetry, there's a sort of a mixing between what's already happening among them and what is about to happen. What's it like to have this kind of prophetic imagination that sees what the world can't? Over and over again, the prophets speak of this in the Old Testament. In 2 Kings chapter 6, there's a picture of how this can happen. The prophet Elisha, public enemy number 1 in the greater power of Syria, because he's able to anticipate when an ambush is being set by the superior military forces of Syria and about to trap Israel's king. Over and over again, he warns the king of Israel to avoid these spots where he would be wiped out. And this irritates the Syrians so much that they send an entire army to kidnap Elisha. They've got Elisha's town surrounded. Dothan is completely encircled by the powerful horses and chariots of the empire. So much so that when Elisha's servant wakes up in the morning, he sees the devastation about to occur. He cries out with this memorable line, "Alas, my Lord, what shall we do?" Elisha says, time for prayer. He prays, "God, open the eyes of my servant so that he can see with godly imagination the reality of our world." And with Elisha opens the eyes, and with his eyes opened, the servant sees the fiery horses and chariots that are protecting them from the enemy. Again, Elisha prays that the eyes of the enemy will be blinded. He leads them into the capital city of Samaria, prays one more time, and according to the Hebrew Shazam, their eyes are opened. And they begin to see the fact that they're trapped inside the enemy capital. The king cries out to Elisha, "My Lord, what shall I do? Shall I kill him? Shall I kill him? I've got the enemy right here." Elisha, with that prophetic imagination, says, "No, don't kill them, feed them. Bring them to the communion table and give them some bread and wine." He throws a great feast, and according to the story, that's the end of the raiding and the war. Peace breaks out between empire and God's people. Prophetic imagination at work, seeing things in a new way that sets people free from the way of war. Imperfectly, sometimes imperceptibly, always inexorably at Willow Avenue, we begin to see in a new way. We see poetically, we see with imagination, we see what really is in a world that is insisting that there's another way to understand reality. A way of seeing that's always available to us on CNN. A war-torn world that depends on militarism and consumerism and a growing economy. So what are we seeing here? We see a foyer filled with blankets and jackets for our neighbors. We see stacks of gift cards being handed out at Head Start. We see extraordinary parents, Universal, coming to our campus and receiving a grant that, according to their director, Lowell Entz, was denied to their home headquarters, but given to this neighborhood. God's prophetic imagination breaking in. We see it as we extend acceptance to people that those of other good people will exclude. Redefining families that recognizes that a nuclear family only kind of way of seeing the world is a blind way to see. That excludes people who need to belong, do belong with us in this family. We begin to see beauty, God's truth breaking through in the beauty that surprises us every week as we show up here and wonder, where will there be new lights dancing to show us the way to the light breaking into the world? We see with prophetic imagination when we see Lynette in Guatemala, Julia in Lithuania, Pakisa in Kinshasa, Dalton in Hyderabad. It's a poem, not a memo. Good thing, because according to Brueggemann, memos will kill you. It's a poem that gives life and light and hope. light breaking out like dawn that flies into our presence on the wings of faith, resting in an image created and sustained from the time of Isaiah and Malachi. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. And John and Jesus, who guide our feet out of darkness of death into the way of peace. We see it even when we're reminded of stories from the past. The movie Noel reminds us of World War I, 1914 Christmas. The enemy troops, the Germans and the Allies, the British and the French, are dug in. They've been in trenches. They've been fighting across no man's land for months. And then someone has the idea of singing a Christmas carol. Somebody else raises a white flag. Someone steps into that no man's land. Before long, the troops pour out of the places in which they've hidden, and they begin embracing one another. They exchange toasts. They start playing football together. And when they return to the trenches, they're no longer able to shoot guns at one another. The orders come. The warning is that it's treason if you don't say yes. So they shoot their guns straight up in the air. They're ruined completely for war. They have to be transferred out of their trenches because they are no longer any good at killing. It's that kind of poetry that God is inviting us to experience, to see, to hear. Wendell Berry says it this way, with another of these poetic imaginations. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing, enriching it, then a long time after we are dead, our lives prepare, will live here. Their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides. The river will run clear as we will never know it. On the steeps where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand, its rich leaf ball drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will be singing in the fields. Memory native to this valley will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend. Legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its reality. Listen, listen. Love, love.